So, good afternoon, and welcome everybody to the Institute of Historical Research Digital History Seminar. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Rachael Haslam, who's a second-year PhD student at the University of York with funding from the White Rose. Rachel will be talking to us about, on the topic, as you can see on the screen, tracing trust and distrust, a network and linguistic analysis of late medieval church court disputes. For those of you who are new to the Digital History Seminar, welcome, and to those who are returning, welcome as well. I'm James Baker. I'm one of the conveners of the seminar. And just to give you a sense of how these tend to work, Rachel will speak for roughly half an hour, after which we'll have half an hour, 45 minutes or so for questions. If you want to put questions in the chat as we're going along, I'll happily ask them to Rachel towards the end, or equally, if you want to put questions in when she's finished speaking, you can do so as well. But if you want to raise your hand and come in and sort of say your question as well, that's fine. So there's lots of mechanisms to get involved. And this, of course, is very much a work in progress environment. So it's always good to have a number of questions. Just so you're aware as well, we record our seminars, and our seminars are posted on our YouTube channel usually the next day. So this will pop on YouTube the next day. So please think about that when you're asking your questions, and whether or not you want to say something that will be recorded and put on YouTube. But as I was saying to Rachel before we started, in the unlikely event there is some kind of dispute or something that we feel is inappropriate to put on our YouTube channel, we'll of course cut that out, but I'm sure that's incredibly unlikely. But yes, it's really lovely to have so many of you with us today, and I'll hand over to Rachel to begin.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present my work at this seminar. So as has already been said, I'm just under halfway through my PhD research, which examines witness testimonies from church courts to understand the making and breaking of relationships in the late Middle Ages. And this paper today is based on the drafts and ideas for my second and third chapters, and I welcome any kind of questions, comments, or thoughts on what is still very much a developing methodology. So over the next half an hour, I'll be talking through my research process and my methodology, which involves integrating network visualization and linguistic analysis with a more kind of traditional close reading approach. After a broad discussion of some of my results, I'll be demonstrating how this methodology works in context through a case study of a 1488 marriage dispute in the London Consistory Court. So as you can see, my paper is titled Tracing Trust and Distrust, a Network and Linguistic Analysis of Late Medieval Church Court Disputes. So my research considers how people in the late Middle Ages understood their relationships with one another, and how relationships were created, strengthened, and broken in the period 1300 to 1500. I use witness testimonies taken in ecclesiastical courts, and I primarily study the language of trust and trustworthiness. My project has 3 key research questions, which you can see on the slide. The first is to consider how individuals in late medieval communities used trust and distrust language to kind of reveal what trust meant to them. And getting as close as possible to the language and overall meaning of the witnesses, I consider words and phrases relating to trust in the testimonies and the different circumstances in which these appear. Secondly, I aim to identify the individuals and also the groups that were excluded from trust in the period and consider the different reasons why this might have been. I do this by identifying the overlapping characteristics of people that were deemed trustworthy or untrustworthy in the texts, while also considering how community structures more broadly could contribute to trust dynamics. Finally, I aim to offer insights into how words and actions relating to trust shifted over the late Middle Ages, so comparing trust in different types of cases, from marriage to tithes to defamation, and also considering the changing role of trust as the language evolved over that period. This work aims to understand what connected and disconnected people in the late medieval period, especially in relation to periods of uncertainty broadly defined. This rests on the association of this period, and in particular the 14th century, with a time of crisis, so legal and social changes, including the rise of these church courts, and also uncertainty from rapid depopulation, from war, from persecution, and even climate change. My working hypothesis in this area is that these external pressures meant that late medieval societies were likely to exhibit an increasingly deep reliance on trust and a less than stable foundation for that trust. And so far, I've found indicators that this might be the case. For example, references in one case to individuals being considered trustworthy since the start of the Black Death, which I think hints at this changing kind of social landscape of trust following a shared traumatic experience, and in that particular case, a strengthening of trust between a witness and certain members of their community as a result. This paper, though, focuses less on this last kind of change over time question and more on the first two, because that's where most of the kind of digital methods are employed in my work. So the works listed on this slide are some of the kind of key foundational texts in this research area. So they include the works of scholars like Ian Forrest, whose book Trustworthy Men highlights the social inequality that's brought out by a reliance of medieval bishops on certain kind of trustworthy individuals or people that they chose and considered trustworthy. Sheila Ogilvie was one of the first to point out that trust has a dark side, which reinforces and creates certain types of social inequality. And Richard Helmholtz has written extensively on legal history and the legal context of the church court material that I use. I think it's important to point out as well that the potential for digital humanities projects for medieval history is often limited by kind of standard issues of transcription and digitization, and my work in this area is possible because of Shannon McSheffrey's transcriptions of the London material and also Jeremy Goldberg's work, including on the Cause Papers digitization project. One of the areas in which I hope that my research can build on this body of work is through these digital history methods. So, for example, many of the authors on the previous slide include the language of networks in their work. So, for example, Forrest notes that trust exists within groups or networks as well as within individuals, but they don't necessarily employ network analysis methods. And in my work, I'm considering the structures of social trust from a direct network theory perspective, so trying to bring out these networks kind of more explicitly. I'll also be examining the language of trust through a more macro lens alongside a close reading, which aims to get to the heart of the kind of social language of trust in this period, and also to see where it might be notably kind of absent. So the sources, that I focus on are witness statements or depositions that were taken in diocesan courts in York and London in this particular thesis. So the dioceses of York and London were much larger than the cities are, and people brought disputes from a wide range of locations, including kind of urban and rural locations. The courts followed a system of church or canon law, and cases could be brought by an individual, so an instance case, or by the courts themselves, so known as an office case, which would often kind of be the result of public rumours about an incident, kind of meaning that the church courts felt that they had to intervene. The individual or the group bringing the case would present a statement and the witnesses as well to defend their position. The defendant could then bring a set of statements to counter the witness or offer kind of exceptions, so reasons why the court should kind of disregard the statement of a particular individual. So they couldn't have a testimony withdrawn once it had been given, but they could discredit it, which I think kind of shows us the centrality of trust building to this particular legal process. The depositions highlight a diverse range of individuals that were testifying or being mentioned in court, and they differ in age, sex, occupation, location, literacy, and social status. They also represent the kind of wide range of cases that came before these courts, which had jurisdiction over disputes like marriage, breach of faith, defamation, clerical discipline, wills, and tithes. Examining these sources, I think, can help us understand the dynamics of trust in different social situations and also offer insights into the use of trust in a legal setting. And I think a comparison of trust in different cases will allow me to explore whether legal contexts and specific types of disputes impacted the presence and functioning of trust, which, at least at this stage in my research, I'm finding that they definitely did. The records of York and London are complementary because they're different in kind of content and presentation. They make for an interesting comparative analysis because of this, I think. So the London material covers the small periods of 1467 to 1476, and also a second deposition book covers 1486 to 1497. This allows for a few focused micro-histories of trust in particular communities in the diocese. And the York material, on the other hand, offers us a range of cases over a 200-year period, which means that they can be analysed for that change over time question that I mentioned before. So the York Hills paper site is a searchable database of key information relating to each case, which is obviously incredible for my research, and I've scraped that database to help me understand the types of people that were coming through the courts. When combined, then, I think these two different source bases cover a wide geographical space in the north and south of medieval England and can offer us, therefore, the chance to kind of cross-validate conclusions and note regional and legal differences in trust language. So the London material has been transcribed and translated by Shannon McSheffrey, as I said, but the sources from York are mostly untranscribed. I think the transcribed depositions obviously kind of allow for a more detailed linguistic analysis, but also the York material offers us the chance to explore and compare a large number of cases and individuals and also kind of relationships across time. I began my research using the London Consistory Court material as a bit of a pilot study to test my methodology, to notice trends, and also just to train myself on the language to help me read and understand the cause papers. And the case study that I'm using today comes from that London material. So my approach combines network visualization and analysis with a linguistic study of trust-related text. The testimonies that I examined were not recorded verbatim, but they were taken and translated into Latin at a later date, with only kind of certain bits of direct speech left in English where the people that were transcribing thought that that was important. This means that the testimonies are more of a snapshot of the particular kind of dispute narratives of the witnesses than they are an exact account of their own words. That means that the network visualizations that I produce by collecting information on the individuals mentioned in each testimony and their kind of relationships with each other are not complete social networks, but snapshots of those kind of bits of relational information, which I think can help us understand the complexities of the case better than if we were to imagine those connections just existing in our minds. And I call these kind of narrative networks. The data required to create these visualizations also facilitates a broader statistical analysis of the identity markers of those people involved and their connections with one another. And I also aim to conduct temporal and comparative analysis of the sources and the visualizations. My second approach considers trust-related language, and it will identify key themes and patterns in the language of trust. And the overall aim of these kind of combined methodologies is to understand narratives of trust and explore the networks of those narratives to contextualize the dynamics of trust and distrust in late medieval disputes. So before I examine the case study in more detail, I'll talk through just some preliminary findings from my linguistic analysis using the corpus analysis tool AntConc. The material that I'm using consists of depositions totaling a corpus of 159,533 words, which is not a large data set by any means, but I think the tools can help find what's representative of the text rather than being potentially more tempted to focus on exceptions in my close reading. It's worth noting as well that there are considerable kind of variations between words given Latin conjugations and declensions, and also in Middle English in particular, there are really kind of non-standardized spellings. I'm not using a stop list or lemmatization because I think that that's one of the quirks of this corpus, and removing or standardizing certain words might dilute the meaning that I'm kind of looking for. This table shows one of the ways I think AntConc is particularly helpful for my research because it can provide the left and right context for particular search terms, which helps us to kind of maintain that connection to the text that's so important for historical research. This snapshot of the keywords in context search in AntConc identifies the trust word fidem in the procedural language of marriage. Seeing that word in context, I think, makes it easier to spot where language is repeated in this procedural manner, as you can see, and can therefore help us spot where other trust language is potentially less procedural and more fluid. So my work considers the language of trust and distrust, and also of trustworthiness and untrustworthiness, and I've encountered these explicitly and implicitly within the text so far. Here I'll just explore some of my initial findings on the explicit language of trust using the example of the Latin word fides, meaning faith or trust. In this table, you can see the 50th to 101st most common words in the corpus, and in the bottom right, you can see that fidem, the accusative singular form of the noun, is the 101st most common word out of 9,924 unique words in this corpus. So it appears 255 times across the document, and this means that trust has a real kind of thematic significance in this corpus because it appears just out of the top 1% of words that are used in the depositions, even though this list includes inflections and words that are common to any corpus like and. To explore this further, then, I use the AntConc regex tool to search for the string of characters that make up the root of the word feed. This returned multiple words that are semantically related to trust and reveals that fidem is used significantly more than the others. The word appears in various forms, including nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and it has a foundational role in the text. Lower frequency words like affidare, meaning to entrust or to pledge, point to a rich vocabulary of trust-related terms being used in this particular setting. So in this next slide, I've broken down the concordance list produced through searching for the fides words in the previous slide, based on who exactly this statement is referring to with a list of with a use of fides and its related terms. As you can see, in the vast majority of cases, the statement refers to the speaker themselves, predominantly using the language of my faith or my trust. This is mostly in cases where the witness is quoting what was said at a particular point, and it occurs most commonly in reported marriage pledges where variations of the words I give you my faith or I give you my trust are used. This is not necessarily the witness talking about themselves. Actually, more often it's a case of the witness reporting the language of the plaintiff or the defendant or another kind of key individual in the case. The next largest category here is referring to trust or a lack of trust in another person. So this consists of cases where the witness is referring directly to their perception of trust or trustworthiness in another witness or someone else involved in the case. So common language here includes faith or trust is to be given or not given to his or her testimony. The group case then refers to groups of people, often the fidedigni, so the category that Ian Forrest draws out as a distinctly legal and institutional group of local men that were trusted within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So the location group, I think, is a bit of a quirk of the corpus, this next group, and it's connected to parish names, which include the word fidus, so like ex-individual from the parish of St. Faith. And then finally, the unknown category consists of a few instances where references are being made to work carried out faithfully, whether that's already happened or whether it might be occurring in the future by unknown individuals. The high frequency of self-referral compared to other instances, I think, can tell us that personal and introspective trust was a crucial element of these types of disputes, and also the legal processes that surround them and are indeed inseparable from them in many ways. The other categories, I think, reflect the varying degrees of relational trust that could shape legal outcomes. Something that I found really interesting here was that despite having encountered the word infidelis or other words for untrustworthy in the York cause papers, no words for untrustworthy appear in Latin in this corpus. Instead, we see expressions of distrust less connected to untrustworthiness, including, for example, the phrase minorem fidem or lesser or smaller trust. Word collocation is helpful here, I think, because we see that minorem appears as the 9th most frequent word associated with our list of fides-related terms from before. So that hints, I think, that many of these trust terms are in reality potentially signs of distrust. This table shows the top 24 words that are collocated 5 to the left or right of our list of fides terms. This is ranked by log likelihood, which means that these words are statistically significantly more likely to appear together than just by chance. So essentially, if you randomly kind of chuck them in with the other 160,000 words in the corpus, they wouldn't appear together as much as they actually do. As you can see, the street name Ivy Lane makes its way into this list, and it's an example of that previous location category that I was talking about, where witnesses say where they're from. They would also often list the street name and the parish, and this particular street in the parish of St. Faith comes up a lot. So it appears in this co-location list, I guess, is a bit of an outlier. Some interesting things to highlight in this list, I think that I'm still in the process of investigating further in this corpus and also in the York sources, is the frequency of body language in this list. So words like osculti and manus, meaning kissed and hands, are inherently linked to the language of trust and faith in this corpus. So late medieval depositions are both legal and social documents, and the language of fides is no different. It can be used, for example, in an oath sworn by faith, or as a personal pronouncement of trust or distrust in an acquaintance. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, some of the language that's used here is the set vocabulary of the courts, and some of it is more fluid. One of my immediate next steps would be to bring out this language into instances where it's kind of clearly procedural and also where it appears more unique. There are obviously overlaps between these two categories, and the procedural language that the witness or indeed the scribe chooses is still highly indicative of trust, but I think separating the language out in this way can help to unpick a little bit more of the social trust that exists within and potentially also outside of the courtroom, as we'll see in this case study. The language of fides is just one example of the sets of language that I'm exploring. Others include notions of truth, promises, troth, belief, suspicion, doubt, and deceit. Hopefully, this one exploration has shown some of the variety in linguistic expressions of trust in this context, and I think unpicking this calls for detailed contextual analysis alongside the corpus linguistics, and the case study that I'll now explore will examine some of this in more detail. So in 1488, Alice Billingham brought a marriage case against John Wells, alleging that the two of them had married on Valentine's Day 2 years before. According to the late medieval law of the church, a marriage was contracted by the speaking of words of present consent in any location, so it could happen outside of a church and it would still be valid. As long as there were 2 adult witnesses present, that marriage could not be dissolved, even if the couple later decided against it. And most marriage cases that we see coming before the courts were founded on one of the parties deciding not to go ahead with the rest of the marriage process, including things like the reading of the banns and formal kind of solemnization, despite this contract previously having been made or allegedly having been made. Wells, in this case, seems to have at the very least flirted with Billingham and entertained the idea of marriage before deciding against it based on allegedly Billingham's lack of finances. And he allegedly claimed that it takes more to make a household than 4 naked thighs, which I think we can agree is quite the quote. There are 11 testimonies in this case, 7 for the plaintiff, 3 for the defendant, and 1 personal response from Wells, the defendant himself. Billingham's only direct witness to the alleged marriage was a woman called Agnes Weston, and she was discredited, unfortunately, by both witnesses for the defendant. So the rest of Billingham's witnesses relied on evidence that they'd heard rumours that the marriage had taken place, which is obviously not the strongest kind of form of evidence. Although my examples of Ankkonk earlier focused on the word fides, the language of faith and trust is much richer than this one example might suggest. These tables show explicit trust language within our case studies. So as you can see, we encountered 2 English words used by the witness Beatrice Thompson, so trial and trust. We also see the word affidati in context here that kind of means entrusted. So the witness is explaining that the plaintiff and the defendant were betrothed to one another, and the language indicates a kind of mutual entrusting. The language of marriage in this period was really inseparable from trust language. So individuals were pledged to marry each other by their faith and by their troth. These performative speech acts, I think, show the complexities of trust language here. So individuals would swear more by the kind of religious faith and also by the social and relational troth. So before examining the trust language of this case in a little bit more detail, I think it's useful to take a step back to view the narrative network of the case. So the testimonies describe a network of individuals and their relationships with each other, which in this case I've visualized here using the software Gephi. The individuals or the nodes have been force directed to repel each other, and the relationships or the edges attract their nodes. The nodes are also weighted by degree, so the names of individuals with more edges appear larger than those with fewer connections. Here, this shows the 3 key figures in the case to be the plaintiff, Billingham, the defendant, Wells, and a third figure, Beatrice Thompson, who employed Billingham and Wells, seemed initially very supportive of their marriage and then decided against it for some unknown reason. And Beatrice Thompson becomes one of these 2 kind of key witnesses for the defendant alongside her husband, Richard, who both claimed that the contract had not occurred. As I mentioned earlier, there are many missing links here. This is a kind of visualization of the relationships that the witnesses themselves wanted to bring out in their testimonies. When processing the data, I didn't include uncertain relationships, and although it's not represented in this graph, I split the relationships into legal, so witness, plaintiff, and defendant, and also social, so family ties or neighborhood associations. Once I've finished my data collection, I'll use this to gain a much broader picture of the types of relationships that individuals were calling on in the courtroom. This, I think, moves beyond looking just at individual testimonies to look for structural patterns of trust and distrust, which I think can be compared across different types of cases. These visualizations, I think, also bring out the people that were not called to testify for whatever reason, but were still mentioned by other people in their testimonies. And this raises even more questions around whose voices we might be accessing here. So the network density of this particular graph is 0.27 to 2 significant figures, so it's relatively connected, it's 27% connected. There were likely many more connections between these individuals and their kind of social realities, but this graph, I think, reflects the fact that relationships in the courtroom were selectively emphasized. The same can be said for the use of trust language, I think. So Beatrice Thompson emerges here as a key broker of trust, and I've color-coded trust utterances in the testimony here in blue. On this visualization, you can see they both come from Beatrice Thompson, and they're directed towards the plaintiff and the defendant. So there are 2 cases of trust language left in English in these testimonies. The first comes when a witness who happens to be Beatrice Thompson's brother-in-law, Thomas, recalls her saying of Wells that he is a Skinner's son and a Skinner himself, and therefore claiming, "I trust he shall have Alice here to his wife." This type of trade-based trust and implied trustworthiness is something that I'm finding repeated throughout these depositions, but here there's a potentially clear reason why Thompson thought this. Her own husband was a Skinner. Nevertheless, I think it's interesting to consider which jobs people associated with trust and distrust, and also trustworthiness and untrustworthiness. And also this particular case hints at the idea that trust and potentially also distrust could be inherited. So in this case, passed on from father to son. The next trust phrase was also allegedly said by Thompson, this time about the plaintiff, Alice Billingham. She allegedly claimed that I'm glad that ever Alice Billingham came in my house, for I trust to God she shall have a good husband. This reminds us of a close connection between notions of trust and faith, especially in relation to God. But here we can also see Billingham reflected well through that link. In my wider research, I'm continuing to explore trust utterances in cases where they go through another individual, so in this case, God, to understand how the flow of trust worked in this period and to kind of identify some of those trust intermediaries in potentially some kind of network visualization. So returning then to our network analysis, we can see evidence in the data to suggest that Thompson was a key controller of the flow of information in this case, or at least that was something that the witnesses wanted to emphasize in their testimonies. She scores highly on closeness and betweenness centrality, meaning that she can quickly get from one node in the network to another, and also that she acts as a key kind of bridge between nodes. Thompson even has a higher betweenness than one of the individuals that we would assume is a key player here, John Wells, the defendant. Others scoring highly on betweenness include Agnes Weston and Constance Stileman, who can both be considered outliers here, I think, because the reason that they have a high score is that they're both mentioned in relation to their husbands who have few ties to anyone else because they're not directly related to the case. So Thompson, I think, emerges as our key trust broker in this instance. One of the particularly interesting things I think about this is that it doesn't mean that Thompson was a trusted individual herself. So it's possible that those defending their positions in court had to rely on more explicit trust language than others, and their kind of acknowledgement of that language doesn't mean that they were telling the truth or were more or less trustworthy based on their kind of use of that language, the language of trust. So verbal acknowledgements, I think, are not the only social manifestations of trust, and individuals and those that they discuss are not necessarily more or less trustworthy or trusted for these kinds of spoken declarations. This, I think, as well, are two methodologies of linguistic and network analysis really can kind of complement each other. It's important to understand how people use language to talk about trust, of course, but clearly something as complex as trust also exists in what I've been thinking about as the spaces between people. This can be better understood when we look at the non-linguistic elements of trust, which the visualizations, I think, can help us to imagine. These methods combined can help to build a more complex and accurate picture of variations and different manifestations of trust. The other aspect of this case then that I wish to highlight relates to notions of trustworthiness. The testimonies reveal that there were only 3 eyewitnesses to the original alleged marriage pledge. These were Beatrice Thompson, her husband Richard the Skinner, and also one Agnes Weston. Both Thompsons claimed that the marriage contract never took place, and both discredited Weston, the only other eyewitness. Their statements are visualized here on the graph in red, and while they don't contain direct trust language, they hint at certain traits which would make Weston an unreliable or untrustworthy witness. So in one of her statements, Beatrice claims that Weston had a loose tongue and was a great liar, who often claimed something under oath and later denied having sworn it. Oath making and breaking were inherently linked to trust, even in language, because individuals would often swear by their faith. Being seen to break an oath could do obviously great damage to a reputation, and that's what Beatrice is attempting to highlight here, I think. Richard Thompson also made a scathing report of Weston, and he focused on her lack of money and claimed that she could often be found drunk. Other testamentary evidence that I've collected suggests that frequent drunkenness alone did not necessarily exclude someone from being considered trustworthy. So, for example, a witness in the 1366 marriage case from York claimed that while a fellow witness likes to be drunk, he was still reputed a trustworthy man. I'm also finding evidence of financial situations being used to discredit statements in other testimonies, sometimes accompanied by suggestions that certain witnesses might be more tempted to be paid to lie in court, depending on their kind of financial background. Connecting back to Beatrice's statement then about Weston as a liar, between the two of them, the witnesses for the defendant have built this kind of picture of Weston as an unreliable and an untrustworthy witness on multiple different counts. And I think that's kind of the important thing to bring out here. Whether this maps onto broader social concept of trust and trustworthiness in this and other late medieval communities is something that I'm still kind of exploring and trying to figure out. But here we can see at least that these accusations combined were enough to cast doubt on a statement in court. Unfortunately, the outcome of this case does not survive, which is a common problem for these types of court records, although given that there was only one eyewitness and Billiam's other witnesses gave only kind of vague and hearsay evidence, I personally don't have the most confidence in a positive outcome for her. Nevertheless, I think this case offers interesting insights into, I guess, the different words and phrases used to indicate trust, both implicitly in the case of the trust language and also explicitly in specific kind of utterances, mostly in this case coming from Beatrice Thompson. So in conclusion then, exploring trust and distrust language through narrative networks provides us with a contextual understanding of the trust-based interactions that shaped medieval communities and relationships, just as they influence our own experiences today. Church court disputes visualized and analyzed for their social network and linguistic properties can reveal the complex workings of trust and distrust within late medieval communities. I hope that today's case study has shown some of how trust worked in one particular community, and as I consider more testimonies, I'll be expanding on the initial findings of this presentation. As I'm currently adding to the dataset, it's becoming possible to consider more general trends and build, I guess, a more comprehensive picture of late medieval relationships in these particular kind of tricky times of dispute. Next steps then for this research include drawing broader conclusions based on the data that I'm collecting. The linguistic analysis, for example, I think would be really strengthened by comparisons with other bodies of text to help me understand what's distinctive about the language of depositions compared with other similar texts from the period. I'll also be conducting a comparative analysis of cases across time, location, and type, and this will help me to explore my research questions further. I also think that these kinds of next steps will help answer specific questions that have kind of come out to me from this paper that I think are central from this case study, including whether it's common for one individual, in this case Beatrice Thompson, to act as a trust broker in a case, and also whether the conclusions that can be drawn from digital methods in this field challenge or confirm existing narratives of trust networks and also exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and for kind of taking us through a kind of, I guess, an exploration of the social concept of trust, how that is made manifest through these kind of recorded trust utterances you're working with, and also that really interesting combination of that kind of linguistic and network work, which I'm still thinking about how I want to ask a question about that, but it's really interesting. So just a reminder to those in the room, please do pop questions you have in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to come in and just say your question rather than write it out. Whilst you're thinking, I'll make a start as chair. And I guess one of the things that I was really interested in is you mentioned towards the end where you talk about the Billingham and Wells case, you mentioned that the outcome of the case was not known and that this is a common feature. And I wonder sort of how you might conceptualize these cases differently if you knew more consistently the outcomes of the trials. So, because I guess you only mentioned that almost in passing towards the end, and it seemed to be, from my perspective at least, when you said that, it didn't seem like it necessarily mattered to your analysis of the trials themselves or analysis of the depositions themselves. But so what is it about the kind of the outcomes that would sort of help you explore this space around trust and distrust?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I guess when I was really new to these depositions, I was disappointed to learn that I couldn't find out the kind of next steps of what happened in these cases. And so just from a kind of inquisitive perspective, it was, I guess, a bit sad for me to realize that I wouldn't necessarily find out in a lot of cases what actually happened to the people that were kind of coming through these courts and whether their kind of legal arguments got anywhere with the courts. But I think that, yeah, it's interesting that you say that it doesn't necessarily affect the analysis. I think for me, the cases where I do have outcomes, it's interesting for me to see potentially how the courts themselves interpreted the trust language that is kind of crucial to these legal arguments. And I guess that depends whether you're interested in more of a top-down kind of experience of trust, or whether social trust is kind of the main focus of the research. I think for me, I'm much more interested in this interpersonal connection between witnesses and between people in their kind of, I guess, their social realities. And so I guess that avoids that kind of concern a little bit more. But yeah, in the cases where I have found outcomes, I think it's really interesting to be able just to see yeah, what happened and how people how kind of witnesses' legal arguments were interpreted by these courts. And I think that that can tell us a lot about the types of knowledge that witnesses had about how they could potentially persuade the courts. And yeah, there's a lot of work on the witness as a legal agent, and I think that would tie in a lot to work on that. But yeah, I think the vast majority of cases, there's either no outcome that survives, or cases were potentially settled before they kind of got to the stage where someone would make a judgment. And so yeah, it's something that I've had to I guess live with this corpus. So yeah, it's definitely more of a kind of a disappointment for me, just based on my own kind of inquisitive nature.
Fair enough. And just a quick follow-up question, because you mentioned sort of witness agency, you mentioned things like top down, and this is purely from my sort of ignorance of these records, and you're the expert here. Like, sort of, so how much do you feel that these depositions are sort of mediated depositions through the structures of the court? And I'm guessing medievalists have a lot of expertise and knowledge in dealing with that mediation, but sort of do you, because you mentioned interpersonal relations, how are you thinking through those interpersonal relations between actors in the court system in relation to the mediation through the records?
Yeah, it's definitely a really difficult question, and one that's kind of really central to the work that I'm doing. I have to say, I think that there's already been a lot of work on kind of unpicking how we might look at church court material. I can't remember the exact title of the piece, but I think Shannon McSheffrey has a piece that she talks about kind of detective fiction, and how we can potentially understand these witness depositions as stories, and as kind of I guess fragments of what might have actually occurred, rather than direct kind of accounts of the witnesses' own words, or even of their own kind of social experiences of a dispute. I think it's really important to acknowledge that mediation. It's also really important to acknowledge that the types of witnesses that were chosen in these cases kind of leaves out a lot of potential witness voices that we might have heard otherwise. And I think that that's something that I'm trying to kind of understand a little bit more through these network visualizations. So, for example, in cases where a witness is saying who was present at, say, a marriage being contracted, they might mention someone who's then never kind of mentioned again and never comes up in the courtroom. And so it's something that I'm still really trying to explore, but I'd love to know what it is about those witnesses that meant that they weren't chosen to be legal witnesses in the courtroom, and why that kind of affects how that affects the way that the kind of case is presented in court. But yeah, I think without kind of trying to skirt around the question too much, it's definitely a really important one, and something that I'm continuing to explore.
And in a way, it draws us towards your computational methods in some way, because like tools like ANCONC are designed by corpus linguists, and corpus linguists work with quote unquote real language. I mean, not always, but they work quote unquote with real language. And you are using a tool that it's not inappropriate to use the tool for your purpose at all, but it's interesting to note that the kind of methods you're drawing upon here have been designed and conceptualized around speech, as kind of real recorded speech, and as so far as we can actually know that it's real. And you're working with a different form of kind of speech and different form of language using a similar kind of conceptual computational kind of toolkit, whether it be the literal tool or whether it be the time you've probably spent thinking about how corpus linguists do their work. I guess that's another layer of kind of thinking through of how records like these get used through these kind of computational processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm still trying to kind of bring out, I guess, the language that seems to me to be more exceptional than the procedural language of the courts, and trying to figure out how much I can say that that is the true voice of the individual that was giving that testimony. I think there's several layers of interpretation between us and those people. But yeah, definitely, I think it will be something that continues to puzzle me and continues to be an interesting part of this research.
Fascinating, thank you. I'm going to read out Brenda's question in the chat next. Thank you for an interesting talk. Brenda says, how do you structure your data for Gephi? What form does the input take? How were the relationships coded? So I guess that's partly a question about sort of how the data gets in, and then partly a question about, I guess you mentioned it at some point during your talk, like the different forms of relationships between people, and I guess how you've kind of pushed those together as opposed to tease them out.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. It's a really interesting one. I think during my pilot study, I took many different kind of pieces of advice from different people that were working on kind of network visualization to try and figure out how the data might be best represented. And I think that what I've come out with is by no means a perfect method, but it seems to work for me, at least for the kinds of things I'm trying to think through. So from reading the depositions from the kind of manuscripts themselves, or from the transcriptions in the case of the London Consistory Courts, I've extracted data for two spreadsheets, so one based on the London Consistory Court material and one on the York Cause papers. And I'm including the type of case, so marriage, breach of faith, defamation, things like that. And then where the dispute took place, if the outcome is known, and the location and things like that. And then in a separate sheet, which is more kind of corresponding with this network visualization and with Gephi, I have the individuals themselves and information on them. So things like their sex, age, occupation, residence, literacy, so their status, so whether they were free or unfree, and also whether they'd testified or not, or whether they'd just been mentioned in the previous testimony. And also the length of time that they've known the plaintiff and defendant, which is something that comes up quite frequently and I think is really interesting. I'm just collecting it at the moment, but I think it could be really interesting to use that kind of data eventually. And then from that, I'm kind of collecting information on their relationships with one another. So this is what I use to create the visualization. So I record whether the relationship was legal or social or both. And I break down the types of these relationships. So whether they were involved in a marriage dispute or a testamentary case, and then also whether they're families or siblings, or whether they have a servant master relationship, whether they're friends, things like that. And this is based on what the individuals themselves describe about each other in the testimonies. And then I've kind of used this data and kind of put it into Gephi in order to produce this visualization. So I guess it's trying to stay as true as possible to the way that the witnesses themselves are describing their relationships, which obviously is kind of highly mediated through the scribes and through the documents that we've got kind of left from these disputes, and also based on the kind of relationships that the individuals themselves wanted to bring out in these court cases. But yeah, I think that's the kind of broad method. I hope that answers your question.
And as a brief follow-up to Brenda's question, I mean, are you, and this is thinking about how your PhD is structured to some extent, so apologies for sort of taking you forward a year and a half into the future or so, but like, are you hoping or planning to sort of discuss at length the decisions made around that data structuring within the thesis itself, as a kind of precursor to some sort of data publication?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to do that and to be kind of really transparent about the ways that I've come about the visualizations and how I'm using them. And so at the moment, I have a kind of a mishmash of ideas on a page, and hopefully once I reach the kind of later stages of a PhD, that will be somewhat more presentable in a thesis format. But yes, definitely, I will be I guess publishing the data set alongside my thesis, and also a description within the text itself of how I've come about kind of obtaining these visualizations and these graphs.
It's always nice to know that PhD students in history are going to be publishing well-documented data. That's always good. So, A question from Annabelle Hancock in the chat. Again, thanking you for the great talk and looking forward to seeing where the research goes. The question is, might you be able to speak more to the relationship between the, quote, procedural trust language you mentioned and the more, quote, personal utterances? What do these terms mean for your material and individuals, and how are you separating them out?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess I'll caveat by saying this is something that I'm currently doing, and so I'd really welcome any kind of thoughts or guidance on this if you do have that. And it's definitely still a kind of developing thought in my mind and in my writing. But I think what I mean by this really is that a lot of the language of the courts is procedural language. So in the cases that in the case study that I explained earlier, it's kind of the language of marriage. So a marriage pledge would include more kind of prescriptive trust language that explains this kind of mutual and trusting, like I said earlier. And then I think that we sometimes get kind of glimpses and flashes of individuals using their own kind of more personal language, which I think in some cases, things like what Beatrice was talking about, the types of utterances that she was giving, things like I trust a God, or I trust that this person will do right by me, things like that. Reported speech in that way, I think, is slightly less connected to the language of the courts, if that makes sense. I'm not sure I'm explaining this particularly well, but I think that there's something about procedural language and the language of the courts that is quite clearly distinct from the language of certain parts of the testimonies, where individuals are potentially allowing their own interpretations of events to come through, and where scribes have kind of left that potentially in the Middle English or translated it in a way that kind of strikes me as less easily matchable to other very obvious kind of repeated sentences. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think for me, I'm trying to understand where we might see glimpses of the individuals and their own personal arguments and their own personal thoughts, rather than potentially the scribe saying, oh yeah, I understand what this means and I'll translate it into the language of the courts.
Would it be fair to say as a follow-up that you're sort of, there's something of a continuum going on here that's quite hard to deal with? This is not the equivalent of, I don't know, you tick a box on a thing that says you agree to a product, right? Versus someone speaking, which don't really sit on a continuum. We have a kind of, I guess, from what you've said, you have a combination of very procedural court language, some phraseology that might be relatively consistent, and then you have bits and pieces that seem more ad hoc. And then alongside all of that, you've also got sort of the combination of, maybe you could speak more to this, the combination of Latin and Middle English being used. And you've got the fact that you're not, I noted, for example, you didn't talk about engrams of different forms, because I'm guessing there's such inconsistency, even in consistent phraseology, that it's not useful to do that. So that's why you've taken the more linguistic approach. So there's a sort of continuum of, yeah, phraseology, standard kind of court language, and that maybe at one end, the kind of the closest you're going to get to sort of the real speech being reported through the court structures.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very good summary. I've tried to take the bits of corpus linguistics and the analysis tools that kind of work best for this very confusing and non-standard language. And I think that, yeah, there's definitely a case for trying to figure out whether that actually works for some of the questions that I'm asking. But I think that what's really interesting about the language of these testimonies is that when they were spoken, only the kind of more directly relevant bits of language were left in English. And obviously that is very much up to the discretion of the scribe rather than the individuals that were speaking those words themselves. And so there comes a point, and I'm not entirely sure when this is, where language stops being translated from Latin into from English, into Latin. But at the period that I'm looking at, mostly you've got kind of maybe one sentence or even fewer per deposition that is left in that Middle English, and mostly it will be where individuals are stating something that really needs to be left in in the language that it was spoken in, and mostly that comes in the form of a pledge, so an oath or a breach, a faith kind of contract or something like that in a breach of faith case. And so I think, yeah, it's a really difficult one to understand what language and what voice we're seeing here, and I think that that's something that I'll continue to unpick throughout the thesis.
Fab, thank you. I'm going to move on to a question from one of our fellow conveners, Alice Kinghorn, in the chat, who again thanks you for a rich and really interesting paper. Alice's question is, I was interested in the concept of a trustworthy vocation and how that was implied in the Billingham case. I don't have experience in medieval records, but I wondered if you had a sense of what made a trustworthy vocation or an untrustworthy one, and if you've seen other ways that this was being implied without being framed in explicit language of trust.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I'm definitely encountering a lot of different jobs that people would consider to be more trustworthy. I think, for example, the case that I've talked about today, there's obviously a clear reason why the person thought that that particular profession was a trustworthy one. Obviously, she'd seen her husband do it and she thought that that's something that was worth including. But I do think that socially there's a kind of identity-based trust and trustworthiness associated with the particular jobs that people were doing. It's just kind of one example, but I'm thinking, I was reading something where a shearer was accused of cutting a woman's purse, so literally cutting the string that was tied around her waist that had kind of her possessions kind of dangling on it. And the entire case was, I think, a defamation case brought by him against her because she'd gone around telling everyone that he had done this, and it obviously had ruined his reputation as a shearer because of the kind of literal association with cutting. Potentially, he even used his own kind of tools of his craft to do that act if he did actually do it. And so I think I'm seeing a lot of reputation damage when it comes to people's careers if they're being accused of something that seems quite untrustworthy, like potentially stealing someone's possessions, and the potential methods in which those kind of acts are done, whether they relate to the particular roles that someone was doing. So in this case, it's very directly, kind of the act of cutting is very directly related to that particular person's role. I think that we're seeing in these depositions some kind of link between that and inherent trust and trustworthiness in those particular roles. I think anything where there's a guild involved or there's a group or a network of individuals that are kind of supporting a person to do their job, then there's something kind of institutional about that, and trustworthiness is kind of passed down through that institution. But yeah, I think also having no job is sometimes seen as something slightly untrustworthy. So I'm seeing real indications that begging or being unable to work were something that people would consider might invalidate a person's statement in court. But I think a lot of the time, as I've said in the kind of main discussion, there had to be some kind of combination of different factors to influence someone's decision over whether someone is now counted as untrustworthy, if that makes sense. So I think one potential breach of trust alone might not be enough to have someone's testimony discredited or have someone to be considered kind of socially untrustworthy. But yeah, it's something that I'm definitely still exploring, and I think that there's definitely a lot of evidence that I haven't yet kind of uncovered about jobs and the role of those in trust and trustworthiness.
Thank you. And I'm guessing as a brief follow on that, I mean, the trust is important, right? The little I know about identity formation in the medieval period is that, you know, that the way in which we construct identities is, you know, complex. And this period, trust is a big part of how someone's identity is projected into the world, right? And so this is, I guess my point is that this is actually quite a substantive topic. Ultimately, you're working in an area that actually is really important to kind of social formation, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Quick question from Mark Jones. I think we'll start to move towards the end. So again, compliments for the talk. Mark says, apologies, this is a bit of a general question, but if I was wondering whether you saw your researchers contributing to discussions on late medieval conceptions of loyalty, whether trust being more interpersonal has similarities with the sense of being loyal to a polity. Maybe a bigger question.
Yeah, thank you. I was just writing it down. I think that's definitely something that I haven't considered of yet. I have seen really interesting talks about concepts of allegiance and concepts of loyalty, and I think that they are definitely inherently linked with ideas of trust in this period. And so my assumption, not having looked into this, would be that yes, that is something that that's definitely associated with trust. But I think in my own research, it's not something that I've encountered so much as of yet. That might just be based on the depositions that I'm looking at, the sources that I'm looking at, being very focused on a particular dispute in one community and less kind of broadly applied. But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm interested in looking into, and thank you so much for the suggestion.
Thank you. So I think we're starting to draw to a close. If you have any final questions, please do pop them in the chat or put your hand up. I'll ask the kind of the question we tend to ask at this stage, which is thinking about what's next. You to some extent gave us a sense of where this research is going within the confines of the PhD. I guess you're also at that point of a doctoral research where you're trying not to add new things onto the Christmas tree. You're trying to refine it down. But I guess the question I asked then would be, thinking about maybe what comes afterwards, sort of after the doctoral research, if that is even possible to think about. What sort of things has this research really opened up for you that you'll be interested in exploring kind of later on, that you don't have time or capacity to do within the thesis, but you think be really interesting to work on, either you doing it or other people in the future? Like, where do you see this kind of going in a bigger sense, I guess?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really good question. Yeah, I think I'm at the sad stage in the thesis where I can't kind of do everything that I wanted to do, and it's always something that people have to kind of come to terms with. The blue sky thinking at the start of my thesis was definitely needs some kind of filtering now at this stage, where I need to kind of get words on paper and understand what I'm doing. But yeah, I've encountered one particular thing that really springs to mind to kind of answer your question, which is a set of depositions. The book is kind of this thick, and I'm not going anywhere near it for the PhD because it's just too long, and quite frankly, it would take me too long to read, let alone to kind of digest and understand in a way that makes sense for a thesis chapter. But I would love to do some work, or to see some work done on this particular set of depositions in this dispute, which happens over about 100-year period and is essentially about kind of burial rights in a particular parish. And there's a lot of language of trust, there's a lot of relational language, there's a lot of confusion and hurt and emotion, and that kind of language I think is really interesting. And I think that unfortunately at the moment in my thesis, I'm not necessarily looking at trust as a feeling. And I think sometimes that's a good thing for my research, because the history of emotions is very complex and would take a lot of unpicking, and I don't necessarily have the time for it in this kind of project. But I think that that would be a really rich study for that kind of more emotional side of trust and that complexity, and where trust is accompanied with kind of other really strong feelings. And so that would be something that I'd love to work on. It's a bit kind of narrow, I guess, for answering your question, but yeah, I'd really love to understand more about that. And I think that's not something that I'll end up doing within the PhD.
It sounds like a very juicy case, and one that certainly emotions does take you in a new direction. We'll take one last question then from Brenda in the chat, which is, will your analysis include looking for collusion? And for example, if it is possible to find linguistic clues within individual disputes as well as across the entire corpus, where collusion by different parties like lawyers and judges within the church court and other influential third parties will be more than the sum of the parts.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I would love to do that. I think there's one particular case I'm thinking of where I found potential evidence in other records of what happened to those individuals and how they negotiated their kind of their legal dispute. And I'm hoping to be able to get to the archive in London over the summer to kind of follow up on that case. And so potentially that's something that I will be doing in the future. But yeah, I think sometimes with these records, it's a case of hoping that you might find something and never finding enough evidence to suggest that that might be happening. And hopefully in this case, that will be something that leads somewhere. But yeah, definitely, I think it's a really important consideration and something that I'm hoping I will definitely find.
Fantastic. So, well, thank you so much for the seminar today, and thank you so much for answering all the wonderful questions. And thank you to everyone in the call for asking those questions. Before we thank you properly and close the call, I just want to flag that the next digital history seminar is on the 22nd of May. It's on a related topic. We will be celebrating the Ruth and Sebastian Arnott's Tudor Networks of Power, and celebrating that as part of as the winning entry to the 2024 Richard de Swart Prize in Digital History. The de Swart Prize, which was founded in memory of one of our long-term conveners, which celebrates the best of digital history internationally. And for those of you who've read or seen or indeed produced yourselves some digital history that you think could be nominated for the 2025 prize, I just want to make everyone aware here that that is still open, and nominations are open until the 30th of May. So we look forward to your nominations, either of your own work or work that you've read that you loved. But aside from that, I think all that remains to say is to thank Rachael so much for a wonderful talk, and that we hope to see you all at the next Digital History Seminar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.